Welcome to our podcast. It's funny because it's true. With me, Tim Clyde.
Me, Alex McQueen.
Where we try to work out what makes stuff funny, the DNA of comedy.
The secret sauce.
Yeah, and today we're absolutely delighted to be joined by a stand-up comedian, someone who not only writes his own material, but then performs it in front of live audiences and tries to hone exactly what it is that makes it funny. We're absolutely honoured to be joined by the wonderful Joe Wells.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Well, where shall we start, Wood?
How did you get... So have you always aspired to be funny and do funny stuff? Where did this all begin?
I've always aspired to not have a proper job. That's the driving force. Do you remember that Pulp song, Miss Shakes, where he says, the future that you've got mapped out is nothing much to shout about? And I remember hearing that as a teenager and it having such a profound effect on me of like the sort of the things which are built for me to be. I don't want to do any of those. I want to do something else. And I have no musical ability. I'm not good at anything else. Very poor at sport. No, nothing. Any other sort of outsider lifestyle.
So can you remember a moment when you were at college or school thinking, I know what I want to be? Or was it, I just know I don't want to do any of those things?
It was more the latter. But I think I always liked funny things. When I was about 15, I saw Ross Noble. And just...
Where?
Would have been King's Theatre. I grew up near Portsmouth. And I just remember thinking that was fantastic, because it's just a bloke talking. But it was the greatest show I've ever seen.
Going from an audience member appreciating the craft in a way to then being the successful Joe Wells now. I mean, what was your first step toe into it, as it were? Did you find a small club somewhere upstairs where you tried?
Step toe, misspoke. Was that a deliberate joke about comedy?
No, not deliberate. But I heard some. But I mean, I was just intrigued as to how you first got into it.
There was. I sound so sort of precocious and deluded, but I was 18 and there was a club in an arts centre and I emailed them to say, yeah, I've written some stand-up. I think I could do about half an hour. Half an hour, which for anyone who knows comedy
is a
ridiculous thing to go. I think you start doing 5 minutes, maybe a push 10 minutes. But I was very confident I'd be able to do half an hour.
And did you?
No, they came back to me and said, well, maybe you can do 5 to 10 minutes. And that went okay.
Yeah.
And
when was that? So how old were you then?
I'd been 18, I think, just before I went to university.
Well done. Wow.
And so who was who would you say your comedy hero was during that era? Who was your...
In that era, it would have been Doug Stanhope, the American.
Do you know Doug Stanhope? No, I don't.
Very, he's someone who politically, there's some stuff that I don't always like. Very sort of abrasive, shocking comic, but there's a sort of heart and a sort of, I think there's actually weirdly like a compassion to what he does, even though it's very like, that's sort of gross and abrasive.
That's very interesting. Well, we might pick up on that in a bit. That sort of head-on collision between comedy being cruel, but also being kind at the same time.
Yeah, and I think Doug Stanhope stuff there is stuff that sounds a bit like him, that is just unpleasant and cruel. Right. But I think that what he does, there's a humanity to it, which I think is very sort of, it's very pretentious to say, but very beautiful, I think, actually. And and Stuart Lee as well which is every 18-year-old.
Okay,
this boy's favourite comedian.
Stuart Lee was a big influence, UK-wise, and then Doug Stanhope in the US.
Yes, yeah.
Could you put your finger briefly on what it was that particularly appealed about them?
I think that, Stuart Lee is like the comedian's comedian, isn't he? When I was watching I like all comedy, I was watching, basically I had loads of DVDs lined up on my sort of student halls and I guess Stuart Lee does that thing where he talks about comedy and it's almost like it's comedy for people that are obsessed with comedy, and I guess it's just the sort of Doug Stanhope's swagger and the way that he would say things that really made you look at things in a different way. And I think his stuff is could be very brave, where he would say stuff that actually his audience didn't like.
Right.
and I remember seeing him doing stuff about how actually America's really great, and that people don't realize that it's and like, but he hasn't. This is in Britain, and it sort of wasn't. It's sort of like a hard sell, but I think I guess his just sort of, the way in which he would say certainly what he felt to be true. I thought that's very exciting, in a way that sometimes audiences didn't always get on board with. And he'd just always have a third angle. I think that so I remember him doing stuff about gay marriage, right? Where his angle was there should be marriage shouldn't exist legally at all. And it was a time when that was the big debate, whereas the two parts where people were pro-gay marriage and people thought it shouldn't exist. And then he found a third path of going, no, I don't think any marriage should exist. But had always really great stuff about, how unromantic it is of people going, I want to get the government involved in what we've got between us. And I thought that I just loved the way he'd often find a third way of looking at things, and a lot of it's a great British comic called Carey Marks, who often has like a third way of looking at a big political issue. And
So it sounds like you're looking for not just comedic effect and entertainment as well, but also an intellectual sword fight a bit from the presenter, the stand-up, that you're challenging people's thinking as well as just telling. So someone like Tim Vine, arguably just doing gags.
See, I like all comedy. So I also I love Tim Vine because he's really, really silly, and I like it when he throws the pen behind the ear, and that's brilliant. And so I don't have a type of comedy that I think is superior to another, but I think that I think stuff that's genuinely challenging, because I think there's lots of comedy now, particular, that sells itself as like, oh, this is really challenging, but actually is reinforcing what that comedian's audience. I'm trying not to name specific people, but there are comedians who will go, will come out with with some
Jim
stuff
Davidson.
about.
Al Murray.
Well, I think Al Murray is more nuanced, but I guess you people who are sort of, who sell themselves as, we're shock comics, that, we're saying the unsayable thing.
Right.
I mean, James Acaster has that brilliant routine about trans comedians having trans people, and then how challenging away he goes. Have you seen the bit I'm talking about? Where he talks about the shocking comedians, and they come out and they say the thing that's really unsayable, and no one gets in their way, and then they do 10 minutes having a go at transgender people, and he says, oh, is that the sort of tone of it is it that challenging to have a go at a group who are already having quite a hard time.
Right.
So yeah, but I like comedy that is genuinely challenging, and I think that often that depends on who the audience is as well. I think that someone like Scott Capurro, who plays in front of broadly liberal audiences, is quite challenging because he says some quite shocking things. But I think if you took some of those things and put them in front of an audience that just agreed with them, then it would be a different act.
Just take us on a brief pathway through your journey from the university into making a living out of being a stand-up. Could you identify the moment when it was switched on, as it were, turbocharged into, oh, I'm going to do this for a living now? Did you have to do other jobs before? What was the journey?
I've only been full-time for about 4 years.
Okay, that'll be that's a good thing to hear.
So I was doing sort of political comedy, and I had a part-time day job, and I think I did some good stuff and some good shows, but I sort of felt like I'd run out of steam about it. When I was a teenager, I was very certain politically about what I thought and what the answers were, and then I became less and less certain, and so I felt a bit lost of comedy because I didn't really know what I wanted to
because
say.
you'd attached yourself to a particular political flag, and when you questioned that, your comedy was questioned.
I think also I just realised I don't know what I'm talking about. I think that's a big problem in society. There's lots of people with strong opinions that they know nothing about. But a thing that happened in my late 20s was I found out that whilst I was going through therapy for the OCD stuff, they wanted to diagnose me with what would have then been Asperger's syndrome, and that so that sort of came out, and then I, as an adult, I sought an autism diagnosis.
What's the difference? Just very briefly, what is that distinction between Asperger's and autism?
So Asperger's is an old term which was dropped because Hans Asperger, his history was with the Nazi. So people don't want to be associated with that. And I think that there's a sort of this could be a whole new podcast. But there's a resistance to. There's a fear that I think for some groups that if you go, well, there's been a history of we're the good autism and then there's the bad autism, you know. And I think there's a sort of movement to go, let's sort of fight
Those,
and also it's not and to talk about.
So yes, so go back to the moment of sort of turbocharging from doing it sort of on a part-time sort of not amateur basis, but on a fun basis to it suddenly becoming your principal focus. What was the moment?
So I wrote a show about the diagnosis, and I had to wait a year for a diagnosis. So I'd had this sort of informal diagnosis as a child where they'd said, we think you meet the criteria for it, but we haven't gone through the proper steps.
And that's for autism?
Yeah. So I mean, they would have said Asperger's at the time, but it would have, and then, so as an adult, I was on this year-long waiting list, and I wrote a show about that. And that was a strange process because I didn't know what the diagnosis would be while I was writing it. So I thought I knew I would have the decision by the time I took the show to Edinburgh. So I had the envelope with the results on stage.
Oh, great.
And then didn't say how the results came back, and gave an audience member at the end a choice whether to open it or not. And
did you do that every night?
Yeah. Well, I knew the whole time.
Yeah, I was going to say, you didn't bring the envelope with you and say, listen, this came through the post as I was getting on the train to Edinburgh. So you knew. And what were you doing there? You were giving the envelope to a member of the audience and saying, do you want to?
There was also a thread about, I went to Lidl once and I saw reduced tins, but unlabelled tins. So you could buy...
that's rather fun.
So
unlabelled cans, take your pick. See what's in there. It could be dog food.
So exactly. So I unfortunately they weren't the real ones, but I had an unlabelled can on stage, so people were given the choice between opening the can or opening the envelope. So
now, why would anyone not open the envelope? As in, why would you call that a choice? As in, what would be the advantage of opening the?
People almost always open the can, see what was inside it.
And you set up
3 occasions people open the envelope.
But you set up the envelope as your diagnosis.
Yeah.
So you can either see my diagnosis, or you can take your pick with this can. And they were more interested in the can.
Yeah. Well, there was sort of a thread going through it of like, I guess there was some slightly leading stand-up, which was about like how. There's all this pressure on someone on the outside saying you're this or this, and that I am someone who's excited by an unlabelled can, and you know, and so I guess there was a little bit of selling the can.
Right.
On 3 occasions, people did say I want to see what's in the envelope.
So that was then. So that show you did in Edinburgh, and what happened after that?
So that did okay, but then I did some stand-up about having a non-autistic brother, which went sort of viral, I believe. And so that was just after COVID. I was going to tour the show with the envelope, and I'd done 2 dates of a tour, and then COVID happened.
Oh dear!
And then and then I wrote this particular bit of stand-up that sort of completely blew up, and lots of opportunities came from that.
And did you put that on YouTube or on Instagram? Or how did you?
It was all over them. Yeah. So I just put a clip on each one. So
that was the beginning. It was through that portal, basically.
Yeah, I had lots of opportunities come from that, I think that's it's that the political stuff. Like I said, I didn't know what I was talking about, but the autism stuff, I knew what it was like to be autistic, and I could explore. I felt like I could, on some level, speak with authority on like a personal level. So it sort of made me more interested in stand-up.
Or unpacking it. Do you think you were doing the autistic angle because it was a confident platform to do comedy, or were you keen to use comedy to talk about the autistic?
Yeah, I think I was really excited about it, finding out stuff about myself, and it also changed how So I always thought, well, I've got to be like a confident comedian. I go on, I go, oh, and and then I talk and look at, like if you watch someone, or like Lee Mack is brilliant, and he like looks at everyone and like that's what's great about it, is you feel that connection when you watch him. And I felt, oh, well, I've got to do that, and all these things which I now see I wasn't very good at. I wasn't good at looking at everyone in the audience. I wasn't good at being like confident and friendly, because I'm a sort of shy, awkward autistic. And I think that having that diagnosis made me, the answer to the question of what makes things funny is people being themselves on some level. So podcast's over. But Tom, yes.
So say that again. Say that again.
I think people being themselves, and I think that's the problem when people try to make broad. And I know I did it earlier in this podcast, broad strokes about what makes comedy good. What makes comedy good for Lee Mack is very different to what makes comedy good for
people being themselves. Is a very good. I very much like that.
And that's what you're definitely yourself all the time, aren't you? You don't. Do you act ever?
This podcast.
I'm very bad at acting, but
you're very good at being yourself.
Yeah, but is acting not? There's a level of you bring a truth to acting, isn't there?
Yes, I mean we mustn't talk about me too much, but now we've started. No, well, there's a very useful. I don't know what the phrase is. Moniker perhaps about acting for screen, which is when you're acting on screen, you need to behave, and when you're acting in theatre, you need to perform. And there's quite a big difference between performing and behaving, and that's partly why I enjoy screen and TV and film, because I prefer just being able to behave rather than perform. Everything requires some adjustment, but I think staying quite close to your natural tempo and temperament is a very important starting place for acting, because you bring that sort of stick of rock. You bring a rod again. This will sound so good when it's done. You bring a stick of rock of authenticity and to the role, which you could then add spokes to, which give it colour and
but it's I'm just trying
interest.
I guess because you get people like McIntyre is just him, Peter Kay is just him, isn't it? But then you take someone like Steve Coogan, who's made characters. You don't really see Steve Coogan. You see Alan Partridge, or some of the characters he makes, and it's a slightly. I think Rob Brydon talked about. You often make an extension of yourself for comic effects. This might be you today, but you're taking certain aspects of your personality and pushing them slightly for comic effect. But someone like Billy Connolly absolutely says that's his.
So I know people are very different on stage, but I still I think Frankie Boyle now is someone who I just think is incredible, the work he's doing.
Yeah,
and he's very, very different off stage, but it's still like it feels like there's still a truth and authenticity to what he's doing. I think he'd be trying to go out and do Michael McIntyre's act. It would be very sort of inauthentic.
Let me just ask you.
But I would love to see that. I think that'd be pretty.
But I presume, I may be wrong, but I presume Malcolm is. McIntyre's quite like that. That it's a slight extension on stage.
Yes, I don't know. But I would guess so.
In terms of your work, would you? First of all, do you get nervous going on stage, or are you as cool as a cucumber? Where are you at?
I'm really good. The thing that makes me really nervous is family and people I know outside.
Very interesting. I find the same. I cannot bear it when I know there's a friend or a family member in the audience. I loathe it. When there's not. It's an anonymous stone that I'm performing to, and it takes away all the nerves, especially in theatre. The lighting blinds you basically from the presence of the audience. You don't even know they're there, which I find very, very comforting. Whereas if I know there's a friend out there's a piece of my mind going, they're thinking you're such a wally. They're thinking, So I'm a big, I completely understand that. But going back to the question, do you generally get nervous, or are you cool as a cucumber?
Generally not now.
Right.
No, I think you get to a point where you've done it enough times that you have built up enough sort of confidence in what you do is, you at least know you got something if things go badly. Occasionally there'll be, a big important gig and you're nervous about it.
And you say that comedy is being yourself, if I've not cannibalized that too badly. Do you put on a persona beyond who you actually are, or do you think you stay very close to you?
Where did I hear this? In some other podcast about comedy, someone said that it's like, what's that film with the things inside the kid's head? Do you know
we did before.
Inside Out.
Inside Out.
Yeah, I think it's like that, where you're sort of like, well, I'm gonna, like, someone says, like, almost like a committee meeting where there's all different parts of your personality and you let one of them chair it, and I think that probably I'm being myself, but I'm maybe letting the slightly more neurotic part of me
chair the meeting. I think that's a genius idea.
Yeah.
The idea that a character is actually a committee, and sometimes it's chaired by one personality in the room, and sometimes another. I think that's a really ingenious way of looking at how you might build a character separately, but also when you're performing, which piece of my personality is going to chair this.
But it's often the neurotic one that's
For you.
sharing your.
I think that often. Yeah, I think that part of me is quite present in what I do. Yeah,
Which is probably driving perfection in a way. I suppose you're pushing yourself. If you're constantly driven by it and appreciating all the things that can go wrong, you're potentially managing. I can't imagine what it. I mean, we did a little bit of comedy back in uni, but your level of regular audiences, it's got to just be like a constant tightrope. And if you feel you've got the audience, they're with you, and it's more plain sailing. This is going to be easier. But when it starts to get tricky, and you feel I've got them, haven't got them, how do you cope with?
Yeah, I think that's the thing you learn when. I think that often that's so. I've had, my wife recently had a baby. We had a baby, and that's one of the things. That first month of gigs, where I went, oh God, because the thing I lost is the ability to gear shift. So I did a month of gigs. Sorry to anyone who came to them, where they were good if everyone was already up for it, but I lost because I was so tired, lost the ability to go, oh, maybe I could shift, maybe do something a bit.
But that was out of exhaustion more.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Sleep.
Well, that takes us neatly to our second section.
Okay.
Which is your sort of working method, perhaps, and what a day in the life of you as a working comic looks and sounds like. But before we go there, what's the worst gig you've ever done?
Oh, definitely Butlins by a long way.
Right.
I did.
Because?
Oh God. Okay. I'll try and make this not too long a story.
That's fine.
It's an adult weekender.
What does that
They're
mean?
all people sort of, I guess, sort of my age, sort of late 30s, but all of whom went really hard in their 20s, but now can't manage it because they're too old. So it's Saturday after, they're all hungover. And
what's the age group here then? So 30 plus.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, but trying to party like they're in their 20s.
Okay.
Yeah.
In Butlins.
Yes, already hanging. The compare goes and does okay, and then I go out. I have some stuff about. There's some stuff I do about having a non-autistic brother. I do that, and it's like a script flip. So I'm being sort of very patronising about. Oh, it's very severely, severely not autistic, and as part of that, at one point I say, actually, I think not being autistic is sort of like a superpower. And a woman puts her hand up and says, no, being autistic is a superpower, and corrects my script flip. And that was the point I knew it was going to be tough. And then I saw, so those gear shifts. I'm like, oh, that's not. I've got some just rude stuff. I've got some stuff about people sending money on the internet, put something rude in there. I thought I can ask them what they put in there, and just people say rude things, and we'll just do that. And I didn't really go for that either. And I tried to talk to someone in the audience, and his name is Jeff, and I don't think that was his real name, but that's what he said. And I'm like, what do you do for a living? And he goes, geography. But no one in the room laughed at that. It was such a mad thing to say. And I was like, oh, you do geography? That's what you do? You're a teacher? And he goes, no, geography. And I go, who do you work for? And he goes, geography. Okay. But no one's laughing at how mad this is. They're just sort of like going, that's Jeff, he does geography. And then I'm going, well, who do you, like, who employs you? And he goes, I've got a mate, Dave. And he'd repeat everything he's known. We've got a mate, Dave. He works in geography. So you go, what's going on? And then he goes, it says, Mr. Kawasaki, he's my boss. And I'm like, okay, so it's Dave Kawasaki. He employs you to do geography. And then he goes, and we go out around town and we show off our moves. And no one's acting like this isn't just a normal conversation. Everyone's just saying this thing.
It's just Jeff who does geography.
Yeah. And then, I mean, this is a really unpleasant ending to the interaction I had. But I said, it's filling time, so I'm like, that's fine. And then I'm shouting, well, what do you just tell me what you fucking do for a job? And am I allowed to swear on this?
It's fucking fine.
And
wow.
well, it's good because he said, I fuck kids. And I was like, oh, okay. But no one responded in any way to this. Like, everyone's just looking at me like I don't know what to say to this. He just has said this like horrifically unpleasant thing. And so like I tried to move on, and
yes, that is a disaster.
It was awkward. So there's so much worse. I'm only scraping at this. There's what you also need to know is that it's Oktoberfest themed. So whatever you're imagining, imagine it all in lederhosen. That's what they're wearing. And then I left eventually, and because my final thing was I thought, oh, they hate me so much that I can get them to, I can be like, oh, I've got a minute left and then I'm going to fuck off, and they'll be like, hey, we hate you. They, well, I didn't even care about that. It's just like, oh, so I count down at 10, 9, 8, and no one joins in and counting down me leaving.
So what's it, back to your working method?
Yeah.
A day, how do you write the material itself? Does it just come to you during the day and you scribble things down, or do you sit and go, right, I'm going to spend 3 hours writing? What's your process of?
I think I have about 10 minutes of material a year that comes fully formed and just sort of like is something I'm thinking about, and it just sort of comes really easily, and the rest is a real slog.
Right. So going to a cafe, being on the train, being at a party, something might just occur to you. Do you make a voice note? Do you write it down? What occurs?
Yeah, usually it occurs on the way back from a gig because I feel like I'm in that good headspace.
Right.
And I don't listen to podcasts on the way back from gigs, certainly for the first hour.
So your mind is sort of tumble driving.
Yeah, and I've got to listen to music that sort of helps me to sort of work things out. So the best stuff comes from that, and then the rest is trying to. The past, often my shows are sort of, there's a narrative to them a bit. So it's sort of sitting down trying to work those things out. But that is a much harder, I wish I could just have those moments. I wish it was an hour of stuff that just came to me. Then I'd be okay. But
And when you're preparing a show, or have you got it word for word in a script, and then you're perfecting that script, or is it?
It's not written down, but probably is more scripted than other comedians.
I'm intrigued as to what degree, in your preparation for a show or a tour, you've got everything down to word for word in a script, or is it a series of jokes in your head that's got a couple of reminders of how you get there? What's your back pocket?
To the end, what's in the back pocket is usually I buy those. I think they're called revision cards.
Yeah.
So it'll be like cards on a key ring. So I've just got like a couple of words for each of those. But I will have recorded them, and so usually it is word for word the same each time. And then sometimes I'll write things out long form to try to. Sometimes I sort of know that the point I'm trying to make or something, and I know there's something there, but it's just really hard to sort of dig out how to make it work. So a method that I was taught by Gareth Richards, who was a brilliant comedian who sadly passed away a couple of years ago. He said to me that public speaking, the people who the stand up is making fun of public speaking. So the people who do public speaking are typically academics, politicians, religious leaders, maybe business leaders, and they're at least purporting to be clever, morally good, and powerful. And stand up has to invert that. So you have to be not clever, not morally good, or not powerful, at least one of those things. And if the politician says something
Like Donald Trump.
Then you can either take the immoral route and agree with him and make yourself look really mean by agreeing with him, and that shows him up. Or you can take the ignorant route and agree with him and make yourself look really ignorant so everyone laughs at how ignorant you are agreeing with him. Or you take the powerless route and you rant about how bad it is, but it comes from a position of I can't. You don't make people feel like you're doing something, because otherwise, if you're good and clever and powerful, why are you doing comedy? You should be running for parliament. And I always think about that.
Can you run that through an example of, say, I'm trying to think of can you run that through an example of someone saying something? Let's think of I suppose Trump might be a useful example. He said something controversial.
Yes.
What's the ignorant approach to? What's the ignorant inversion of that?
So the ignorant version would be to take what he said at completely face value, not have any critical questioning of what he said, and be like, they must be eating the dogs because he said it. He wouldn't lie on television, would he? So
embrace it. Embrace
and just be like, oh, that's terrible. They're eating the dogs, and that be your. I know that in and of itself is not funny, but that be your angle to just sort of agree with it and not have any critical thinking about it. The immoral way of looking at it would be, blaming it on that's genius. Or to make stuff up in a debate is genius. I'm going to start doing that in every argument I have. I'm just going to say, well, do you want people to come and eat your dogs, and use that as an excuse in an argument? And then I think the powerless thing would be maybe done more earnestly, but Mark Steele does that so well, where he would just sort of his style, I guess, is quite ranty, but you never feel like he's going to come off stage and actually overthrow the government. And I think that sense of like, oh God, I can't believe Donald Trump is saying this on TV. We're all doomed, and he's going to be president. And I thought it has to come from that sort of angle. And certainly, I don't know whether that's a hard rule, but I think that running anything I do through those three things, and it doesn't have to be political, I think that Michael McIntyre talking about, I love that bit he does about if someone asks you for a pen and you're like, oh, I had a pen, I don't know where it was. Yeah, that can come, you can do the same thing with that. You can sort of run it through the same things.
No, see, because I've always seen his kind of comedy. It's almost like he's not fumbling around for jokes; he's fumbling around for truths. It's like he's almost just trying to. Unlike Tim Vine, who's grappling great word plays or just really silly, fun flips of logic or things, or surprise in a bit of linguistic fun. It's like the comics. Like it seems McIntyre's just seeing things and going, if I say this, will 70% of the audience agree with me, therefore laugh, just out of like, well, it's so true. It's so true. And then it's fine. But I'm sure there's something more. You're suggesting there's more to it than that.
I think a lot of, I don't know what any individual comics process is, but I think a lot of that observational stuff, it weirdly comes from that powerlessness place, because you watch that Jerry Seinfeld is like, why do we do this? This is weird. I can't change these social interactions we have, but this is what happens. This is there's never any sense of we should do this differently and change it. It's just sort of, this is what happens. It's weird.
So, give us a day in the life of you, in terms of do you dedicate 9 to 5 to sort of generate?
My day is so physically and mentally unhealthy that they'd be embarrassed.
I used to mention then but you don't have a routine of going to Starbucks, sitting down with the laptop for 8 hours and hoping for the best.
Oh, that's why I do this, is to get out of it. For the past, let's ignore the fact for the past 3 months it's been dominated by my beautiful but very grumpy daughter. But before that, sometimes if I had a fringe show, I try to sort of work on that in the day. I was sort of gigging sort of 3 or 4 times a week. So it's going out to do gigs and yeah. But
Do you feel when you're either on the train after a gig or trying something up, do you think you know when something's a funny? How good is your barometer of test? Or do you just trial and test?
So certain of things, and they completely fall flat. There was one. I can't. There's sometimes I will think things and be really clear on things that they're going to work, and they don't. This isn't a good example, but I had like a callback in my latest show. I set up. I went to see my dad a couple of years ago, and he's fixed the fence in the garden, and I said, "Oh, you're doing that because you're thinking about getting a dog, aren't you?" And my dad said, "Yes, that's the medium-term plan." And I said, "Oh, what's the long-term plan?" And he sort of acted like it was a weird question and just went, "I guess I just get old and die." So I sort of talked about how I quite admire that sense of purpose. His life is going to fix the fence, get a dog, die. That's what he's going to do. And then later in the show, I talked about seeing my dad, and it was a sort of like emotional bit. And I said, and he's got a dog now. And I thought everyone would make the leap that he's going to die soon. That's what I'm saying. But no one made that connection at all. But to me, that connection was really obvious. So I remember in a preview doing it and going, he's got a dog now, and waiting. Because I thought it would take a moment for it to click for people, and then it would. But it didn't. And people just looked at me like, okay, it's got a dog, yeah.
What's next? Okay.
Yeah. So I think sometimes that can happen where you think...
Are you under pressure to produce material at any point in time? Or, no, that's just a ridiculous question. I'm going to start again and move away.
I am under pressure because we live in sometimes we live in a social media age, and I think in some circles of comedy, there's an expectation that you upload a video 2 or 3 times a week.
Right.
And I'm not great at crowd work. I do sort of written stand-up.
What does crowd work mean?
Oh, yeah, talking to the audience. So yes.
Oh,
so I don't do a lot of that. So I don't upload that amount. But I think there can be that pressure of sometimes when you see people who are so sort of prolific in what they do.
But it's interesting. Do you see the online and offline experience of crowd work the same? Are you departmentalizing in a gig? There's you talking through your narrative from jokes and getting a response, and then there's that section which is crowd play, but that's the same as the offline experience of having your audience and building it and putting things up there for. Is that how you're, or did I misunderstand?
Also, no, I mean, a lot of the time, the people that are very prolific with stand-up online is they're filming every gig and talking to the audience and putting clips of that interactions online. So that's a way that you can generate 3 video clips a week rather than writing 3 stand-up bits.
Because you can't just keep putting your jokes.
Yeah. But the thing with crowd work, I think it's such a live thing as well, where sometimes there will be a thing that happens in the room, and it's just really exciting in the room, and I never find it that funny.
Do you think there's a formula to what makes something funny in terms of setting up a joke and writing material? Have you got a formula that you follow? You've sort of alluded to it already in this refraction of refracting material or ideas. So those 3, what could we call those? Lenses, perhaps. Yeah, the powerless, ignorant, and
unkind. Yeah.
Are there any other formulas or methods that you use to generate material?
I think I always try and think about. I mean, again, whenever I do think that, I realize how sort of unhealthy my relationship with stand-up is, because I do use it as therapy, and I think a lot of the things which I've sort of tried to work out to myself, I've been thinking about what do I think about this thing. My latest show, which I'm touring in the autumn, is
where are you touring in the
all
autumn?
all around England,
Good show.
and Dublin. Is all about knowing that there's an increased chance that my child will be autistic and thinking about that. So I guess I would just, often it starts from a place of how do I feel about that? And then I think once I've got the sort of mechanisms of how I feel about a thing, I can then go to a joke about it.
Do you think even within your methodology of the way you do it, there's a little trick that makes, you've talked about the 3 lenses, But if you think of what's your most successful joke, your go-to, this works every time, what is it within it, do you think, that resonates with an audience? Or
I think, I guess it's this is the thing everyone says about comedy, is surprise, isn't it? A lot of the time, where if I can, and one of the things I'm more of like I'm sure someone else said on this podcast, it feels like people either writer performers or performer writers, and you sort of favor one. And I definitely would be a writer that learned how to perform. And I think the performing I've learned is that I can mislead people with tone of my voice.
need one way?
Yeah, I have a joke about conspiracy theories and how they're comforting. That's why they're popular, because they're comforting, and they could be like comforting in a frightening world. So, like, for example, one of the ones that my friend believes, he believes that the British government has a plan. Just leave it as that. And if you make it look as though, if you tonally do that wrong, if you go, yeah, the tone of that matter, he thinks the British government has a plan, that just works. So I guess that's a very obvious example of
No, but I really like that distinction between the tone that you can adopt versus the content of what you're saying, and using it as a comic device.
And I think that was one of the things which I had to learn, because it wasn't natural to me to go, I can mislead people with my tone and make people think I'm going a different way.
So surprise is a crucial element.
Yeah, I think so. And certainly those are the comics that I like, where Sam Campbell, I think, is brilliant, and I never know where he's going with what he does. And I think that's what's so exciting about it. Even though I've worked in comedy for years and years and years, he's always surprising. I never know what he's going to say.
So what do you think is the value of comedy?
I think that it's about power, and I think it gives power to people who have no formal power. I think there are people in the world who have formal power, who are politicians or business leaders or whatever. And I think that comedy is in this space where you don't have that formal power, but you can say whatever you want, and you can say things about people with formal power. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something which I'm always excited when I see, and I think that is something which, particularly when you read about comedians in countries where there are fewer freedoms than in this country, where you feel very proud to be a comedian. So yeah, I feel like it's almost like part of like sort of the checks and balances of people.
So like we talk about like an old-fashioned jester, the way the court jester would be any person who'd talk up to the king and point out things that aren't quite right with humour and irreverence, and allow that the tricky conversations can be almost better spoken with jest.
I think so, and I think as soon as you sort of start believing that, you become a bit too earnest. That's the sort of the trap of it. But I do think that, and I think that if you look at politicians, some of whom are around today that don't like to be made fun of, I think that's a really sinister thing, and I
think that's where the value of comedy becomes incredibly apparent. Being able to throw rotten fruit at those who think or feel they have a right to impose their will on others is a valuable tool.
I think also it can club comedy, which I really love. I love the Comedy Store, I love Komedia, I love the Glee clubs. And I think they're so. If people haven't been to a comedy club, they really should. Because I think there's so much discourse about comedy, and I know that we're part of it now. But around particularly political discourse around comedy, and then if you go to a comedy club, you're like, oh, this is so different to what was being discussed online. This is for people trying to have a laugh and have a good night and have a lot of fun. But I think what's powerful in those is, I think, comedy is not as diverse as the general population, but I think it's more diverse than a lot of other cultural things. And I think that if you go to a comedy club, you will see people from very different backgrounds all having their say. And often those comedy clubs will be in front of audiences that maybe don't mix with people from those backgrounds, And I think that's very powerful and exciting. I remember seeing Fombi Omotayo in front of an all-white audience from the area, probably as quite sort of conservative audience. There are probably people in that audience who didn't have any black friends, hadn't heard black British experience, and he's talking about his experiences, and people are listening to it. And I think that's really exciting to see those experiences cross over and people hear from those experiences. And one of my real things I feel strongly about is that that things which are mainstream are more radical than things that are not mainstream. And I think we have this idea that the most radical piece of theatre will be something that you go to see in a tiny little theatre and there's only 4 people there, and it's really experimental. Whereas I think the most radical cultural thing is something that's really mainstream that everyone can plug into, but you're hearing from people that you maybe didn't hear from in other sort of cultural spaces. So I think that to me is a value in comedy.
And what would be your advice to a comic behind you in the queue, as it were, who wants to be where you are? What would be one piece of advice you would give to one of them, given what you know?
I think it's that thing about being yourself. I think don't try to model yourself on other people's comedy. Watch loads of comedy would certainly be one. Watch lots of club comedy. Watch comedy you don't like and think about why you don't like it and what you would do differently.
That's very useful. I think I've learned that a little bit as an actor. I learn a lot more from seeing it not done particularly well.
Right.
I think I'll avoid that. And all that's, whereas, and not necessarily from good stuff, because you don't realise it's good, because it's just good. So I think it's much better.
So for you, Joe, what when you were looking at other practitioners of comedy, what did you see and go, that's not so good. I don't want to be. That's not me. Without obviously naming names. I hate Lee Mack.
I think it's that insincerity thing. I think particularly new people when they start. I started around the time when Jimmy Carr and Frankie Boyle were like the 2 biggest comedians, and I think they are both brilliant. But there were people doing a sort of version of that wasn't as good because it wasn't sincere to them, and they were trying to
Be outrageous.
mimic that. Yeah, and also, and then the other thing that was popular around the time I started was Mighty Boosh, which I think is brilliant. But there were lots of people trying to do a sort of weak version of that, and I think that stuff that's sort of insincere, I think, is
that would be very good advice, I think, to an up-and-coming comic, because they might think, oh, that's proven territory, that works, I'll do the same. But actually, it sounds like to me the opposite is true.
But no one's ever going to be interested in a second-rate version of something that already exists, because you would just go and watch
the full-rate version, yeah.
Yeah, and Matt Lucas talked a lot about when they thought of Little Britain, because at that time there was an awful lot of really good sketch show comedy. So that to try and eke out something new with a different rule book on a different standpoint and have an observation, actually they weren't observing British life in a way that a lot of sketch comedy wasn't doing.
And everything that's ever been good has been not following the rule. I think sometimes that can be a trap that maybe TV producers fall into sometimes, of like, we know this works, so let's do another one of those. Whereas I think all the things that I like,
the Peter Cooks, the Monty Pythons, they all broke the rules that had come before them.
Yeah. And I think we're in the advertising business. We're constantly under pressure to know that we've got the answer that'll work. And obviously, clients, when they're nervous, will go, "Well, this is a formula that works. Can we make it more like that?"
Yeah.
As opposed to trying to break the norms.
I think sometimes it can be easier to do the thing that works, because then if it flops, people can go, well, I did it all right.
Wasn't our fault.
Whereas if you'd sort of do something that's a bit more, but then the risk-taking things become the thing that, The Office was a risk, and then that becomes the thing that everything has to be, and Fleabag, I guess, would be like the modern thing where everything now is like, oh, we want something that's like Fleabag, but the reason that was successful was because it wasn't like
anything.
And this will come before it. That's a good point. In terms of coming to a conclusion, what, if you were asked, do you think ultimately makes something funny? You've kind of alluded to it already, I think, but I wonder,
Oh, I don't know. I guess it's something that's, it's weird, isn't it, that I don't really know the answer to that, because I could say, some of the stuff that's surprising, but then often things which, when you can see a joke coming and it does, that can be really funny as well. So I think all these things are things which can help, but the thing I always like, occasionally when I've had asked to talk in schools and stuff like that, I've always said all these things which I think make good comedy, they are just tips, that I'm never going to tell someone how to do comedy, because I don't really know how to. I don't know how to do it myself.
Well, I think that's a very, very, fair answer, because
It'd be a very weird world if it was just a simple ABC. Because if we could all do it so simply, there wouldn't be any magic or comedy in it.
Well, I think my sister's a teacher, and I was asked to talk. I think I overthought it. I was about to talk to their school about comedy writing. But any sort of tip I had for them, because one would be like, make sure your jokes are short. If you can short punch it, that's good. But actually, I really like stuff that can be really long and literary as well. So, it's not any rule. There's a sort of there's a big exception to it, isn't it?
Yeah, we were talking to Bill Snedden, the editor, and he was saying about the timing being so important when you're cutting jokes as they're on film, and they're getting timing exactly right. And then we said, but you sometimes have an instance where a joke can go over long and then become very, very funny. And he immediately talked about an Alan Partridge scene which he cut where it becomes funnier and funnier because you overplay the joke.
Yeah.
So every rule has a non-rule. It's almost
Remember, have you seen the Borat scene where I think it's a deleted scene where he asks, "What is this?" in the supermarket? Have you seen that? Yeah. So he goes to the cheese section and he's asking, "What's this?" And the guy goes, "It's cheese." And then, "What's this?" "It's cheese." So for about 10 minutes. It's really funny.
But it's just because you know what's going to keep going on, and it's almost fulfilling your expectation of what's going to. So it's not a surprise; it becomes a non-surprise. So all the rule book of you make sure you land the timing and you surprise people. That's very, very funny. Where it does neither of those things.
Yes.
So it's
I suppose the fact that it's not a surprise is a surprise. Maybe that's how it works psychologically. I don't know.
Excellent. Perfect way. Thank you very much.
Is that okay? Thank you.
That was magnificent.
I'm
Thank
so
you.
nerdy about comedy that if I talk about it, then I can just become.
Not at all.